good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us today for our Future Feed Explorer Series webinar entitled Only as Secure as Your Supply Chain, Why Risk Management and Visibility Are Mission Critical. Today's webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with a link to the recording. You can enter questions at any time during the webinar into the Zoom platform, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And we'll send a separate email with answers to any questions we weren't able to get to. Today's webinar is sponsored by FutureFeed and by Summit 7. FutureFeed is the leading cyber GRC platform used by the defense industrial base to achieve and maintain CMMC compliance readiness. At FutureFeed, we're committed to securing our nation's supply chain from our adversaries by creating an affordable, collaborative IT management platform. Summit 7 is the trusted partner for Department of War contractors for cybersecurity, compliance, and managed services, with the largest team of certified experts in the defense industrial base. Summit 7 helps defense contractors secure their information systems and meet CMMC requirements so you can keep doing your part for our country. Well, the Future Feed Explorers webinar series was created to arm defense contractors with the information you need to understand and address the requirements of CMMC. And throughout the series, we're going to share critical insights from industry experts and best practices for achieving and sustaining CMMC compliance. Equally important, we're going to share the why behind the CMMC program and its requirements. And while the focus of many organizations is on receiving a CMMC certification, the real objective must be ensuring their ability to protect the sensitive information with which they are entrusted and with which they create. And CMMC can't be approached as a checkbox exercise. It needs to be viewed as a corporate and as an individual responsibility to secure our nation's supply chain from our adversaries. Today's webinar looks beyond your own organization's CMMC status to explore the influence those in your supply chain have on your overall security posture, your regulatory compliance, and ultimately your organization's ability to operate. And we'll also explain how your customers and ultimately the Department of War look at you through a supply chain risk lens. And it's important to note that when the CMMC program transitions from 800-171 Rev 2 to Rev 3, there are additional requirements for supply chain and risk management that go into effect. And we're also going to explore the elements of supply chain risk, the common challenges organizations face, your current obligations under CMMC and the DFARS, and ways to mitigate and minimize supply chain risk, including illuminating your supply chain to provide visibility to sub-tier suppliers. So my name is Stuart Itkin. I'm Chief Security Evangelist at FutureFeed. Much of my career is centered on supply chain and vendor risk management and regulatory compliance. I served as a member of the CMMC Standards Working Group and in the establishment of the CMMC accreditation body, now the Cyber AB. I'm a founding board member of MSPs for the Protection of Critical Infrastructure, and a director of the CMMC Industry Standards Council. And joining me today are Amy Williams and Joy Beland. Amy Williams serves as VP of Cyber Illumination at FutureFeed and is a member of the Cyber Guild Advisory Council. Amy is a nationally recognized expert in cybersecurity and compliance and brings extensive experience in CMMC assessments and NIST 800-171 implementation, and she's brought clarity, integrity, and excellence across the defense industrial base. Joy Beland is the Vice President of Cybersecurity Compliance for Summit 7, with decades of experience spanning MSP leadership, cybersecurity education, and CMMC assessment. Joy holds CMMC Lead, CCA, and PA, CRISC, CISM, and QTE certifications, and serves on the board of MSPs for the Protection of Critical Infrastructure and for Innocent Lives Foundation. So Amy and Joy, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stuart. Happy to be here.
Great. Good. Well, I may be dating myself here, but if you remember, there was a television show called The Weakest Link, and the weakest link in each round was the person whose performance it limited the amount of money that game players could win. And at the end of each round, Jane Lynch would pronounce, "You are the weakest link. Goodbye." And so are you ready to play the weakest link? And actually, every one of us, every one of our companies is already playing. Your compliance and the risk to your business are only as strong as the weakest link in your supply chain. And when we look at this from the perspective of the Department of War, the integrity of any platform is only as strong as its weakest link. And so let's take a look at the F-35 supply chain, as an example. So Lockheed is the prime contractor for the F-35. There's over 5,000 companies in the overall F-35 supply chain. And every one of these suppliers influence the security F-35 program and the overall integrity of the platform that's delivered. So let's look at a narrow slice of the overall F-35 supply chain. So Lockheed, the prime contractor, has several tier one subcontractors. You can see this includes Northrop, BAE Systems, RTX, and many, many more. But if we look just at BAE Systems, its suppliers sit at tier two of the F-35 supply chain. And L3 is one of those tier two suppliers. And L3's suppliers, in turn, fall within tier three of the F-35 supply chain. Pratt& Whitney is one of those tier three suppliers, and in turn, its suppliers fall within tier four, and Pratt& Whitney suppliers, such as Woodward, fall into tier five, and the total supply chain continues to go much deeper. The point is that a weak link anywhere in that supply chain can impact the overall program. And what's important is that every contractor, subcontractor, and supplier has customers. So every contractor and supplier, I guess you need to look at this from two perspectives. You need to look at risk as yourself as a supplier to your customers and what risk do you represent to your customers. But you also need to look at it from the perspective of the risk that your suppliers represent to you, that you are essentially their customer. And when we look for weak links in the supply chain, it's generally the small sub-tier suppliers that don't have the same resources as the top-tier suppliers to address security. Ellen Lord, who is the former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, called sub-tier suppliers, the small suppliers, the soft underbelly of the supply chain, so that small, non-traditional contractors were the most vulnerable link in the defense supply chain. And while one could think the likes of Lockheed or BAE or Raytheon or RTX now would help their smaller sub-tier suppliers, the fact of the matter is that most don't. I recently was on a panel where someone asked the question of the panel, why don't the primes help? And two attorneys that were on the panel both raised their hands and said, it's us. And so with apologies to Jan and Dean, the big guys know who their small suppliers are, but they leave them alone for fear of liability. And it's kind of, if they tell them what to do and they do it, and then one of those small suppliers experiences an incident that costs their company money, does that prime become liable? And so essentially they've elected to kind of leave it alone and not to bother with it. So talked a lot about risk. Risk is a broad concept. Amy, can you help us understand what we mean by supply chain risk? What supply chain risk encompasses?
Sure. Thanks, Stuart. So supply chain risk is exactly what it sounds like. We spend a lot of time just wrestling with the risks inside our own walls, and that's challenging enough. But when you are dependent on an entire supply chain to make a product or to provide a service, it becomes much more complicated. It's, we all know that there are people within our own organization who are the human risk, who click on that email, et cetera. But it's really daunting when someone clicks on an email that's 3 levels down in your supply chain, and that has an impact on your viability as an organization. So there's a lot to wrap our heads around, and risk is a lot broader than just thinking about how you're going to monitor devices and put up firewalls and provide training. There are a lot more elements to it beyond that, beyond what your customers represent to you and what you represent to your customers. And while you transition to the next slide, I'll just say that during CS5, we had a supply chain workshop where we asked the participants to do a live map of the risks in their supply chain from a very simple but realistic scenario. And we found that what people were facing stemmed from supply chain architecture problems, from business model problems, from contracts problems, and from cultural problems that were all dressed up as cybersecurity. And when we started putting specific problems that companies were facing into buckets like IT, HR, operations, et cetera, most of the risks related to CMMC fell into the operations bucket, not into the IT bucket. So that was really eye-opening for all of us. But there are cyber risks, there are IT risks, and the risks that we're talking about here are, from a cyber risk, one single unpatched system in a tier 3 supplier can open a backdoor straight into your most sensitive programs. And from a compliance standpoint, if a tier 3 or 4 supplier fails their assessment and you're highly dependent on them for your own viability with a particular product or service, then where do you go and what do you do if that disqualifies your entire supply chain? Financial risks, there's, reducing profitability, increasing cost with companies facing a lot of different financial pressures right now. And if a key supplier's operating on super thin margins, they can burn through cash very quickly. And your first sign that someone in your supply chain is failing financially isn't necessarily a bankruptcy notice, but rather missed delivery on systems. And then from an operational standpoint, just a single source supplier, as I was saying, if there's no redundancy in your vendor list, then that creates some problems for you. It's a single point of failure for your operations. And then, of course, we're in very complex geopolitical times where, there's export restrictions and then typical things that have been going on for years where there's a foreign acquisition that you didn't see coming, and that has an impact on your critical components. And then, of course, all of these together create a complex, we bring all those risks together, it creates a more complex risk than we could ever possibly imagine. So there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to think about. And risk is multi-layered, and it's a really big concern to address these risks.
Yeah, and we certainly saw the impact of financial risk, over the last couple of weeks. It wasn't really a supplier, but it was a managed service provider that had financial problems and that abruptly closed its doors and left a number of defense industrial based contractors without access to their operating environments, and certainly having an impact on their ability to deliver. And we look at just the current climate and geopolitical risk, either with change of ownership and foreign private equity firms buying U.S. businesses, changing the landscape, or even the very tense situation we see in Taiwan right now with China and the talks that have been going on. So, we've identified these risks, and addressing supply chain risks, can be challenging for DIB contractors, and as we said, especially the small contractors. So what we did is we asked the Home Office in Sioux City, Iowa, and they put together the top 10 list of supply chain challenges companies that DIB face. So let's start with number 10.
All right, I'll take number 10. Limited visibility into the low tier suppliers. So there are a number of reasons for this and issues that are related to it. So flow down clauses can lose their teeth. The further down the supply chain you go, you have a little less visibility. In many cases, when you get down too far in the tiers, then contracts can become purchase orders. And so tracing that when there aren't really even formal flow downs becomes an issue. Vendors are protecting their positions by not sharing information on who they're outsourcing to. So knowing that the company above them might possibly contract directly with the company below them, given half a chance, creates a lack of incentive for visibility. There are just basic security limits on how we can share and what we're sharing. And enforcement beyond the layers 2 and 3 can vary. So contracts at lower tiers are often, as I mentioned, purchase orders, which makes it challenging. And then just the sheer complexity obscures the relationships that are taking place across the DIB. I often refer to the supply chain as, a box of sparkling lights
Mm.
for the holidays where they're all tangled in what is a prime contractor on one contract can be a subcontractor on another. And it's, it's very difficult to untie these relationships and get clarity. There's also just the basic issue that small and medium-sized companies kind of lack the tools and knowledge that they need for proper reporting up through the supply chain. So there's all sorts of reasons for that lack of visibility.
Mhm.
So Joy, number 9.
Yeah. And, depending on what industry you sit in and where you're at in the supply chain, I don't know that these are ranked in a particular order because I look at this one for a lot of the suppliers and I'm like, well, I bet they feel like this could be number one to them, right? So the dependency on foreign or fragile sources, there's a great report issued by the GAO in July of 2025, and it addresses all of the risks that are posed by dependencies on the foreign suppliers. They had several, I want to say 8 or 9 different supply chains that they targeted to identify what a huge risk the foreign influence is. And they picked 3 of those to talk about some specific examples. The first one would be aviation. And it's a great report, by the way. You should download it and you should read it. But the adversarial nations that we rely upon for some of the sources to the aviation industry is pretty in depth in the detail that it goes to. And I always feel like the F-35 program gets picked on. It's such a commonly referred to example of supply chain. And this report, though, uses the F-35 program as one of those examples where it talks about the DoD program officials, being notified that, oh, well, it turns out that a lot of the parts in the program or the supply chain was really experiencing some under suspect. And so when the DoD program officials went in, they identified several areas, but one of them was that the Chinese made robotic arms in the assembly line. And that was a company, like Stuart had referred to about the ownership things that's happening. It was a company owned by a German manufacturer that was bought by a Chinese entity. And so they had to look through all the way through the supply chain for something like that. We also have the fact that lithium batteries and all of the different minerals that we know China has largely consumed all of the production and housing the bulk of these minerals throughout the world. And so that's become a real threat to us. Even submarine shipbuilders that need titanium castings are relying on foreign suppliers. So many different areas in that, that are of foreign influence that we have to take a look at and see how is it that we would address when we have no American or friendly nation manufacturers available for some of these things. We're definitely putting ourselves in a pickle here.
Right. So number 8.
Yeah, another multi-layered single point that is very challenging to tackle. The cybersecurity risks are very tremendously across the supplier network. Smaller companies, obviously, this is the thing we talk about the most. They have fewer resources, they lack the budget, the expertise, the awareness to implement required controls properly. And then, this is one of the things that is like nails on a chalkboard to me is that when client compliance becomes a checkbox behavior rather than risk reduction, there is such a huge opportunity to learn how to protect all of your IP through something like, yes, it's unpleasant, it's uncomfortable doing the CMMC required controls if you haven't done this before, but it's also an opportunity to secure your networks in ways that haven't been before. And looking at it as just a checkbox behavior, it just you're hurting yourself and taking that approach to compliance. And we say that that so compliance doesn't equal security, but anybody who's compliant with a regulation that wasn't compliant before, I guarantee you is going to be more secure than they were beforehand. So it's an important consideration. Also, depending on what's being built, a supplier might be, a cloud native startup, or they could be a manufacturer with decades of old OT in their environment. So there's just inherent differences in the security postures of companies across the DIB.
And
There's no standard technological baseline. I'm sorry, Stuart, I got a bunch of these. It's no standard technological baseline across, it's like, there are a lot of companies that are Microsoft shops, but not everybody in the DIB is a Microsoft shop. Not everybody can be. So we can't really say you're going to be compliant with particular technology and then secure that technology. There's geographic and jurisdiction issues related to security expectations across the globe. And then there's human factor variability and training variability across companies. And then I guess the closing line on all of these risks is that there's a compounding problem when you take all of these together. All right, now I'm done.
yeah, no, and thank you for all of that. I mean, certainly, it really helps expose how broad just that one issue of cybersecurity risk is. So let's go on to
Yeah.
number seven.
Yeah, fragility. What a great word this is. The small suppliers, I personally, when I owned my own MSP many years ago, I had a couple of contractors that I provided IT services to, and some of these suppliers are so small. They're heavily relied on, but they're so small that literally they like, I'll have to close my doors, or I can't make payroll if I need to implement that security solution, and all the way up to current day. I've talked to people in the last 5 years, two different suppliers that have literally said, well, I know that my prime can't do without me, so they're just going to have to deal with it. Right. And so what does that mean to the prime? What does it mean to that whole supply chain? If there's refusal on the part of any of these small businesses, a lot of these are second or third generation. And, they've been doing what they've been doing the way they've been doing it. It's never broke. They don't want to have to fix it. And you just can't convince them. So, really understanding how many of them are willing to just close the door and walk away. I mean, it's a pretty fragile ecosystem when you have that kind of reliance on a very small supplier.
Yeah, absolutely. So number six, regulatory and compliance complexity.
I have fewer things to discuss on this one, but it's still very complicated. So just within the defense industry, you've got DFARS 252.204-7012 plus Section 889 restricting use of Chinese equipment and Section 5949 on semiconductor restrictions. But then above and beyond that, we've got companies that are trying to comply with um, uh, you know, ISO standards and and international standards, and just something as simple as access control is going to be an important part of every single regulatory requirement related to cybersecurity. But the way that you need to handle your access controls is going to vary across each of those different frameworks. And so that becomes complex and complicating. Um, and then there's just variations in responsibilities across the supplier base. Many companies are starting to think about exiting the DIB or have exited the DIB based on feeling that it's too expensive. And then what the three of us have been in CMMC from the very beginning, and we've noticed the regulatory churn that comes from just the multiple revisions to CMMC and the fatigue that has caused across the DIB.
And, and it's not just, we focus on CMMC, but I think you alluded to it, all of the other requirements that in organizations, so there's ITAR, there could be
Yeah,
EAR, GDPR, ESG, and depending on the industry, and that list goes on.
right.
So let's go on to number five, long lead times and production bottlenecks.
Yeah, I'm going to take this from two perspectives because the first being, here at Summit 7, where we are helping on the implementation side, the long lead times, even for a certification to happen in itself, like an organization being able to bring their infrastructure or the people who are working with CUI into compliance, being ready for that third party assessment, or even doing a quality self assessment. That's we've been saying from the beginning. This is a 12 to 18-month process. Now there might be, and hopefully there are a lot of solutions coming out now that where if you're able to operate in a way where you can grossly narrow the scope of where that information flows, so you could do it faster. But just the implementation part of it is a bottleneck. We may at some point see a bottleneck with the C3PAOs and the availability of the assessors. We've not experienced that though. It's more on the readiness side. But then when I see the word production, I always my mind goes immediately back to the manufacturers. I think because Amy and I had such a fresh experience with this in at CS5 and both being involved in manufacturing sessions. And the best representation I've seen of what these production bottlenecks look like in the manufacturing sector is represented in Allison Giddens' book on the middle of, I think it's called The Middle of the Sandwich. And she just so pricelessly captures what it's like to be completely dependent on the vendor approved list that your primes are giving you. And, no matter what you're doing to be able to have your part ready, you can't actually ship out what you need to ship out without every other piece in the puzzle falling into place the way that it's supposed to. And you can't go outside of that list, right? So if you've got an
Yeah.
approved list and you're forced to rely on those resources, no matter how they are performing, that's where you're at right there. And so it's really caused fragility in the supply chain itself, just because of being so narrowly focused on so few suppliers in a lot of these areas. The other thing is that that networking diagram that you showed that looked like the Christmas lights, for those of you who are paying attention, many of those dots were connected throughout to other suppliers and other contracts, as an example. So whoever you have downstream from you that's doing chromium plating on an airplane part, they're not just serving you. They're serving, their customers, and the amount of contracts that they could be working on, which we'll talk about some of the capacity constraints too. That's also going to be a factor. And then, of course, we have geopolitical disruptions that are going to occur. I know that, what's happening in Ukraine, Taiwan, there's a lot of concern about what, even when you think that your supply chain's in order, you never know what's going to be happening with geopolitical concerns.
And I know, I mean, in the news recently, there's been articles on the diminution of just our stockpiles, given the situation in Iran and how long it's going to take to be able to rebuild that to the prior state of readiness, just given how long it takes to really produce and deliver all of those different munitions and supplies that were used. Let's move on to number 4. So poor data integration across the ecosystem.
Yeah, this one is another one that has a lot of layers to it, and my mind went in a bunch of different directions related to this one as well. But just simple things like SPUR scores are separate from assessment scores, which are separate from where you keep your POAMs, which are separate from where you keep your audit logs, and who has access and visibility into all of that. And it would really behoove the prime contractors to have visibility into those scores, but it's very challenging to provide those scores. And, beyond, we send out surveys to the people in the supply chain, and whether they report them back or whether they report things back correctly, whether they understand what it is that they're supposed to report back. Do they understand the difference between a UEI and a UID, for example? So all of those things, just kind of a lack of understanding, but also a siloed approach to collecting information across the ecosystem creates problems. And then there's just basically no shared visibility. Primes can't see supplier compliance in real time. There's inconsistency in the reporting formats. The data is stale. There's a real lack of understanding of what a polyam is in the ecosystem. A lot of companies think of a polyam as something that you track just to get your CMMC certification one time and then you're done. But in reality, you should be tracking your polyams in real time and updating your score in real time and then reporting your score in real time. And we're just absolutely not doing that whatsoever. There's no integrated mechanism to verify supplier compliance. There's no continuous monitoring across the supply chain. There's no automated CUI tracking across systems. Most companies don't even know exactly where CUI lives in their systems. Most companies start their CMMC assessments by, or their gap analysis and preparation for the assessment by looking at CMMC access control number one and trying to answer the question without even understanding where CUI lives within their organization. And then, there's just the problem when bigger companies acquire smaller ones, because that's not necessarily the answer because it moves distributed risk to a correlated and consolidated risk, which makes that acquiring company a bigger target.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a bunch of different issues around that.
Good. So moving on, number three. Thank you. We got demand surges and
Yeah.
capacity.
I feel like I bundled it with number five already pretty well,
Okay.
but the demand surges, and this is largely going to be driven too by new contracts coming out, and are they running in the same vein? There was a great panel at RSA that was focused on Golden Dome. And when they were talking about, what are the capacity constraints and what are we seeing already in the organizations that know that they're going to be participating. So we know that this is a problem out there and there's going to have to be some changes made. I'm always going to circle back to that vendor approved list. I think that for the primes to take a look at how that can be made more flexible or more robust. I think that that's going to be one of the key answers here.
Got it. And moving on, number two, supplier consolidation and single points of failure.
Yeah, another big issue. We know CMMC was came on the scene because we were concerned about cyber attacks at lower tiers within the network. But single points of failure can come from things other than cyber attacks. It can be natural disasters. It can be, labor disputes, financial failures. All those can halt an entire program. And then, military readiness becomes hostage to those single companies' success in these scenarios. And the adversaries really only need to compromise one large, supply chain, one point that is successful to bring down, the ability to protect the warfighter on multiple levels. So that's a really big concern.
And I know one of the topics that's come up recently was addressed in the May 5th FAQ from the DOW, supplier consolidation, and to what extent might that constitute a significant change? When does a significant change then require a recertification by a DIB
Yeah.
supplier? So a lot of things to consider. And so moving
Mhm.
on to number one, technology transition challenges. Joy?
Yeah, I think that this is going to vary drastically across different industries in the supply base. But really, it's, the question of are you going to be transitioning to a government cloud off of a commercial? Is it going to be straightforward enough that the environment looks and feels the same to the, people who are doing the actual work? Or are you going to have to make a huge lift and shift of your technology? And there are even challenges in the physical parts of this. It's not just technology for all of the digital products, but you have technology that's involved in protecting your facilities, the security protection assets, and looking at it in a more holistic view. I know that even in the MSP industry, like there's so many MSPs out there that are trying to support the smaller businesses and make sure that they'd be ready for CMMC. But I'm going to tell you, Stuart, for the
Mm,
first 3, 4 years of CMMC being a real thing from 2021 to 2023, 2024, most of the security vendors in the MSP industry were just completely quiet about it.
Yeah.
Would not give answers as to whether or not they would be creating a shared responsibility matrix, whether or not they had US persons supporting on the back end. Like they just would not answer, or they flat out said, no, we're not going to support CMMC. I got to tell you, I was more happy about the ones that said, no, we're not going to support it
Right.
because at least the MSPs had an answer and knew that they
Yes.
had to replace that in their tool stack. So, it's a huge problem. I'm really happy to see that the Cyber AB marketplace that they proposed is going to, in some way, address these are the vendors that you actually can be using, right? Whatever that is, because the technology transition, my biggest thing that I hate is when we have a customer come to us at Summit 7 and they're on their third MSP in 3 or 4 years because they were promised a
Right.
bill of goods that couldn't be delivered on, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. Don't you can't make
Yeah.
a wrong decision when it comes to that.
Mhm.
No, absolutely. And we talk about technology transition. I mean, even within the standards itself, technology is transitioning at a rate that standards aren't keeping pace with. So we look at the evolution of 801.71, Rev 2 is still, fairly perimeter security based, less cloud aware than really we need to be given the current state of technology that exists. But so members of the defense industrial base do have specific responsibilities with respect to security and supply chain monitoring. And as we said, some of these responsibilities are going to increase as CMMC transitions from Rev 2 to Rev 3 of 801.71. But Joy, why don't you walk us through some of these responsibilities?
Yeah, this is pretty basic information that's been out there for a while, but really depending on the type of data that you are possessing, processing, store, transmitting, and service of a contract, it's going to deem the flow down requirements that are going to come in your contracts. And so at the bottom for level one, just basic FCI, the contract itself, most of the times, that's going to require the protections of the FAR Basic 15 controls. That has an annual self-assessment and affirmation that comes along with it. But that's not an option to flow down, right? So all the way from the top down. At level two, depending on the type of CUI that's going to be included in that contract, the contracting officer is going to deem whether or not that's a third-party assessment requirement in order to serve on that contract, or if it's going to be a self-assessment. And then at level three, of course, you're adding on an additional 24 controls. Level three is definitely going to be the type of CUI that is going to require additional protections against APTs or advanced persistent threats. And really, that designation is based on how much additional risk is the DoD putting in sharing that through the supply chain in CUI. So that's the different levels that are and the different requirements. At level three, we are going to be requiring or seeing that a C3PAO or a third party is going to have to first assess that environment, and then DoD's DIBCAC team is going to come in and do the level three certification. So, and it's very clear in DFARS. This is the contracting mechanism that the DoD is using to ensure that they protect the accurate and correct protection mechanism is in place throughout the contract. And, it says right here in the italics at the bottom, the contractor shall include this clause, including this paragraph, right, in subcontracts. And then towards the bottom, it says the contractor shall determine if the information required for subcontractor performance retains its identity as covered defense information and will require protection under this clause. So this is a big responsibility from the prime all the way down through the supply chain. Every time that you're subcontracting in service of this contract, you need to look at this and determine, all right, is this something that has to be flowed down according to DFARS 7012? It does. Yeah. And then there's a little bit more about who bears the responsibility as it goes through the different stages. And, one thing that we're seeing at Summit 7 is a contractor and a managed service provider. So when we see RFIs and RFPs, now we're starting to already see what the requirements are going to be. And that level, at that, the prime is as they're ensuring that they could bid on a contract, they're supposed to be going down through the supply chain to ensure that everybody would have the requirements necessary to fulfill it. And so it's interesting that we're seeing these come out so quickly now with the language for CMMC in it. But then they are supposed to, as a prime, verify that their subcontractors have agreed to the DFARS terms. They're not just supposed to put it in the contract and flow it down. And that goes all the way down through the bottom of this chart where they're continuously ensuring that, okay, now that we've been in service of the contract for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years out, is the supply chain serving on this contract still qualified to be handling the CUI that we're sharing with them? So that's where the continuous responsibility comes in. And then a little bit more information about the data types that get shared, because we do have some leading indicators. We have some information that has been shared out now about the types of or categories of CUI and where we can see that the department is thinking that a third party C3PAO assessment would be required at level 2 versus a self-assessment. And we have in gray there, at the third line down, Controlled Technical Information, or CTI, and DoD Critical Infrastructure Security Information, DCRIT, are a couple of categories. The NNPI to me is an obvious one, just naval nuclear propulsion information. And we have a lot of customers that have this kind of CUI. So we're knowing, you should know, be able to look through the contracts that are available on each of the agency sites and see, all right, this is one that I'm currently serving on. It's going to be coming up for renewal, or this is one that we would want to be bidding on, and understand how that agency is viewing the requirements in advance. A lot of that information is being shared out now.
Right. And so we've talked a lot about risk. There are a number of things that that companies within the defense industrial base can do to kind of mitigate that risk, or at least to minimize the potential impact of that risk. And we're going to kind of talk through risk scoring, diversification, and supply chain illumination, which I think is becoming increasingly more important. Let me start with risk scoring, and I'm going to kind of go through this a little bit quickly, just in the interest of time. But one way that again organizations can go through is to really incorporate within their risk management process a means of identifying risks. What are the risks that they face? And then grading each of those risks on the basis of what's the likelihood that that risk is actually going to occur. And then if it did occur, what's the impact of that risk occurring? And generally putting this into the form of a heat map here, where the highest risks are in the upper right, the ones where there is low risk, low impact, low likelihood on the bottom left side. And typically an organization then is going to focus on what is it that we need to do to be able to address those that are in the red, and then those that are in the orange, to be able to bring them to yellow and green, to be able to look at and mitigate the risk. But I think, the point is, in order for you to mitigate risk, to limit the potential impact, you need to understand what they are, and then you need to have a means of being able to prioritize, to understand what are the most important ones to deal with. And so, for example, and this is a real case where it was the North Korean bad actor scheme, the risk of a foreign national posing as an employee getting access to all of your classified information. The impact of this could be huge, but the likelihood of that could be small. If we look at another incident, the likelihood of a ransomware attack is certainly going to be greater than perhaps hiring a foreign national, but the impact can be, similarly as big. So having a means of identifying what those risks are that we believe are there, and then secondly, scoring them, and then third, just having a very deliberate process to go and to address those risks to be able to mitigate them in some way. And it kind of, I think, the last point I want to make on this is, risk is multidimensional. Amy talked about this earlier, and so it's not just looking at cyber risk, because cyber risk is certainly important, but understanding a supplier's risk along all of the different dimensions of risks. And somebody could be green with respect to cyber. They could represent a huge geopolitical risk. They could represent huge financial risk. And being able to understand that to ensure that the decisions that you're making about suppliers are multidimensional, or the conversations you're having with suppliers about addressing their own risk, again, are multidimensional. So let me move on to resilience. So being able to recover in the event of an incident is really important. So Joy, talk to us about resilience.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a reason that the primes and the large contractors have not just dedicated managers or individuals to supply chain risk. They have entire teams, right? And they want to be resilient in their contract awards and be successful and accountable to their stakeholders. So a lot of the activities that we see here, really, this is about mapping who it is that is in that grid that you showed at the outset of this, Stuart. Who's your downflow, who's your upflow, what happens if, because that's what the DoD is interested in. And one of the reasons that there's mandatory reporting requirements is if there is somewhere in that chain a breach or an incident, they want to know what the potential impact is going to be across the supply chain. And they also want to be able to look at other areas where this is a vulnerability or a risk and be able to proactively get out there and assist with it. So, mapping and understanding your supply chain. Do you have a clear diagram? Diversifying suppliers. And it's pretty hard to vet a supplier, and especially the higher up you go in that food chain, it takes a very, very long time to get any modifications on that approved vendor list. So being able to proactively do that, I have a family member actually that works in the defense supply chain, and he does the procurement and supply chain for a very cool business in Southern California. And he proactively went out and was able to vet some suppliers and get them in line because he could see that there was going to be a bottleneck happening. And hearing firsthand what that experience was like, and this is not a huge contractor, it's a decent sized one, but really it takes a lot of work to do that. And so increasing the supply chain visibility, when we were talking about that at the outset, one of the harder things is that I think that the Department of Defense, I've always heard Department of War, they can't demand an entire list of the supply chain from any of the primes. So the primes are kind of, it's up to them to get as much visibility as they can. Um, I think the rest of these are pretty self-explanatory, but when it comes to increasing supply chain visibility, one of the positive ways that I could look at this as well is that we have some customers that have gone out there up the supply chain as soon as they got their CMMC level 2 certification. And in those announcements, they were immediately put on the map for additional awards. And so you can look at that a few different ways, right? Um, Maintaining the strategic inventory buffers. Now that's a lot harder depending on your financial status. How much can you have in inventory, versus just in time? Um, the supplier risk is something I'm looking forward to Amy talking to. I was involved in some of the early days of some of the things that she's going to be talking about next. But I think that being able to have a realistic view of what kind of risk does your supply chain represent is going to be crucial for every prime, every large contractor throughout that tier. So, yeah, investing in analytics, collaborating across the ecosystem. I'll say that there's such amazing resources out there. At CS5, when we had our manufacturing workshop, it was kind of surprising how many contractors there at that conference hadn't been to a CMMC conference
Yeah.
before, hadn't accessed a lot of the expertise that's available. And even just in that workshop, I'm like, you guys all have to get to know each other and be in peer groups and working groups and start to really, this isn't a time to be, protecting your, um, I don't want anyone else to know about my special widget. Everyone knows. Let's all talk about the best way that
Right.
we can have a lot more expertise in the supply chain to make this work the way it's supposed to.
Exactly. Supplying or securing the DoD supply chain or DoW supply chain, I mean, is a team sport and we all need to be
Yeah.
part of it. So we talked about visibility in the supply chain. I don't want to cut Amy short because this is really important stuff. But talk to us, how can companies kind of get that visibility into not just their direct suppliers, but into their sub-tier suppliers and why is this important?
Yeah. This is a sneak peek into something that we've been working on, cyber illumination, that is related to all of these issues with supply chain visibility. And we've been thinking through, how can we make it easier and how do we make it less expensive, less onerous, and less challenging. And so what we've been trying to build is something that we're calling, or have been building, is something called cyber illumination. Um, and this is to give prime contractors real-time visibility into NIST 800 171 and CMMC compliance postures across every tier of their supply chain. And the way that it works is that a prime contractor will invite their tier ones. They can say who they want us to invite. We will automatically send out the invitations. They'll be invited to join. It's not mandatory that they join, but they will also, anybody that does join can then invite their suppliers. And the idea is that we're building, real time supply chain visibility and improving um, the way that all of this is available in real time. When someone updates their score, for example, there will be a timestamp related to it. You will be able to see that there's, for example, 5 layers into a supply chain, but you won't be able to see the names of the suppliers. You'll just be able to see the scores. So you get a sense of the how the suppliers are doing with their CMMC compliance further down. And I know we're running short on time. So if you want to advance to the next screens, we've got a couple of screenshots just to kind of whet people's appetites. And if anybody wants to know more about this, feel free to ping me after and I'll be happy to talk about it. But this is the visual representation, and what every company will see will be the score in the middle, the 100. That's for a made up company called Cyberdyne. All of this is made up. You'll see some famous names on this. These are just put in for purposes of illustration. But what a larger circle means is that you've got more companies in your supply chain that have reported in, and then the number itself is a score. And we've got 3 things that we'll be able to show you: the CMMC compliance of any individual company. So if you click on the next screen, you'll see that we've clicked on, I believe that's Boeing. I don't have my glasses on, but and again, this is not actually Boeing. This is an illustration of what it might look like. But you can see the companies that have that they asked to bring into cyber elimination and what those company scores are. But you can see that all you can see are the scores. You don't see the names of the companies and the tiers below. But it gives you a sense of how that part of the supply chain is complying with CMMC. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to run through this really quickly. If you want to go to the next screen.
I was just saying this one, I mean, you kind of remember the picture we had of the F-35 supply chain. You can kind of
Yeah,
think of that just kind of, as an overlay on that.
yeah, for sure. Other things that we're able to illustrate, in this case, we've got the flow down visibility. So you can see the percentage of the tiers below each organization that are visible within the supply chain, and where you might need to do a little more work to recruit companies in. you want to go to the next slide, you'll just see um, the expansion of that for an individual company. And then finally, on the next slide, the flow down compliance. We're tracking the average compliance for any particular supply chain. If you go to the next slide, Stuart. So this shows you the number related to the flow down compliance. That's yeah. And then yeah. So if you clicked on any individual company, then you would see where the average compliance exists within their flow downs.
Very
So
good.
that is a very quick
And sorry to cut that.
intro. That's good.
And Joy, I think, one point, this isn't a one and done. You do kind of looking at your supply chain, or you illuminate your supply chain once and say, I've done it, or do risk assessment once.
Yeah, we're seeing that significant change, all the confusion that is surrounding it. So, people very easily can be going in and out of being compliant. We saw with the example you had spoke about the MSP, like what happened to their customers when they went all of a
Yeah.
sudden shut their doors, who had a CMMC level 2 certification, but now they have actually no one else on the other end of that shared responsibility matrix. So there's a lot to do to maintain constant visibility into that supply chain.
Right. So let me, just kind of try to summarize. Yeah, we've talked a lot about a lot of things in the course of this. Is just a very, very rich topic. But I think the key point is, you certainly don't want to be the weakest link within or within the supply chain you participate in, and you certainly want to make sure that you identify any weak links in the suppliers that are supplying to you, and the things that you can do, to be a strong link, or you can deliver consistently and on schedule. You can know the suppliers and sub-tier suppliers in your supply chain, and you can understand where there are vulnerabilities and work to mitigate those. Diversification so that you're avoiding critical single source suppliers, and fourth, to ensure your compliance, not just with CMMC, again, with other regulations like ITAR, GDPR, ESG, and finally, be resilient, be able to recover quickly from any disruption. So again, a lot to unpack here, a lot that we've covered. Uh, and again, before we get to, I think we'll just have a short time for questions, but let me remind you that we will send an email with a link to the replay of this webinar and to be able to download the slides, and certainly encourage you to join us for future webinars in the Future Feed Explorer series. So with that, see if we have any questions that have been submitted. And just to add, please feel free to follow up with any one of the three of us if you have questions. If you want to learn more about illumination, then certainly reach out to Amy, or you can reach out to Joy or myself with other questions that we have. So let me just see if we have any questions here. Just see a couple in here. One, does FutureFeed have a module to automate subcontractor risk assessments aligned to DFARS flow down that helps? Amy, I think you've answered some of that question.
Um, we don't have the ability to automate that. No, we don't.
Yeah. So I know that again with cyber illumination, while we're not automating it, we're asking people to report and be report and for it then to be reported, and looking at incorporating a risk management module within the Future Feed product is something that is on our roadmap. So that risk assessment that I talked about, risk scoring, is something that we're looking to incorporate within Future Feed in the future. Let me see if we had any others that are there. Good. I think that really covers the questions we've had at this point. Again, if you do have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to any of the three of us. Joy and Amy, thank you very much for your insights and perspectives today. I think we shared a lot of great information, and want to thank everybody who's joined us today to tune into this episode of the Future Feed Explorers webinar series.